was sort of curious about, because I mean, I actually really like your thesis. I find it very intuitive, and I've done my own digging, and I think it's a valid risk that investors should be thinking about how to hedge. But I also am curious about why we don't, or do we, or have we observed similar phenomena playing out in other markets? Are there any other foreign analogs in either in credit or in some other market maybe, or certainly in equities, that might provide some map or some guide or model about how this plays out? I mean, obviously, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my understanding is that a major motivating factor in your thesis is the change in regulations, the migration from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, a lot of the IRAs, the 401ks, that sort of stuff, and the changes in regs that mandated a move to the least expensive products, right? So motivated this move to passive. Are there analogs? I mean, I know that the superannuation model in Australia certainly mandates savings. There's other models around the world that approximate the same sort of objective, obviously with some nuanced differences. But is there any other model you can point to that might provide some kind of map or indication about how this whole thing evolves and plays out?
So the quick answer is that unfortunately, as you highlighted, this is an exponential function. So it increases in terms of its severity and impact as it gets further and further through the process. The only analogs that we can point to are markets that have been managed in the past, right? So people have heard me talk about the Nazi stock market, for example, right? So, and that, by the way, did not end well. On a single day, it fell 90% when it was reopened effectively, right? So the answer is no. And that creates, part of the problem, right? Is that I have a hypothesis. Not, it's the word thesis can refer to an English essay in which, here's the thesis of my essay, right? But if we're talking in scientific principles, what I actually have is a hypothesis that is unknowably true until the events occur that actually demonstrate that this was the case, right? And so part of the challenge is that this is in no way the only thing that's going on, right? There's lots of other stuff that is unique to this market, and technology moves apace in a variety of ways. And so, for our investors, one of the things that we've been increasingly writing about is that you need to understand not just the flows, but also the mechanical process that emerges as equities are increasingly used both in index form and in single stock form for things like structured products, right, which are used for yield enhancement purposes. And those structured products have never really existed, right, in part because we never had interest rates this low that led people to forego many of those protections that are created by the limited liability corporation, right? I mean, the irony is somebody who, if you look at the academic literature and you look at the data series in terms of volatility selling, right, the XIV is something obviously that I played a role in as well. People would do the math and say, well, selling volatility has the same return profile as being long equities, right? So, and it carries better, right? It offers higher current income associated with it, right? And yet when you actually are selling equities, all you've done is remove that protection on the left tail, right? You could theoretically lose a hell of a lot more than you actually put into the trade, right? And so you should expect a higher premium associated with it, right?
I don't think that's theoretical anymore.
Well, so again, this is part of the irony, right? We saw it with the XIV, and then people continued to do it, and we saw Alberta. I mean, you guys are largely Canadians, right? So, I mean, you saw Alberta investment management blow up, right? Now, blow up is too strong of a phrase, right? But the losses associated with that product, I think, actually, one of your guests was highlighting the dynamics there that a strategy that it had, a 6+ Sharpe ratio throughout its history. Now, if you look at the entirety of its history, is a -2, right? And again, I wish I could lay credit to it being my observation. Neil Chris at Hutchin Hill, is famous for the expression that a high Sharpe ratio asset is just one that hasn't seen its left tail event yet, right? And that's a perfect illustration of it, right? The XIV went to zero functionally in a couple of days. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were talking about the diamond. They're like, well, did you get the warning to scale up the trade? I'm like, it went to zero in 2 days, right? I mean, when was I supposed to scale up that trade? Come on.
You obviously weren't watching.
Yeah, I just wasn't paying attention, right? I mean, the amazing part about that trade actually is that I know professional investors at very well-known firms that were buying XIV into the closing minutes of February 5th, 2018. And I mean, these are guys running billions of dollars that did not know that there was a NAV ticker associated with XIV. They were paying $72 for it. The NAV was printing 11, right? I mean, it was like, you did what? Like, I don't understand how I lost money. I'm like, oh my God. Like,
But efficient markets.
yeah, exactly.
That also,
Yeah, I was going to
it
actually
also
ask
reminds
about.
me.
Oh, sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead, Mike. You
No,
go.
go ahead, Richard. No.
No, I was going to ask. I mean, as Michael pointed out earlier, I mean, this your hypothesis on passive flows is part of a larger mosaic, right? And we all obviously know that rates have been at ZERP level for a while, and I think maybe it's these regulations that have allowed for passive flows to become such a large part of markets as a whole that has differentiated U.S. markets from perhaps European or Japanese markets that have had zero interest rate policies for such a long time. But in recognizing all of this, I mean, Buffett said if we extrapolate interest rates at zero for into the future, we're likely experiencing cheap stocks as opposed to them being expensive. So how do you kind of put all these different moving parts together and perhaps even understanding that some players may be adding fuel to the fire, witnessing this mania and sort of just adding fuel to surf the bubble up?
Wow. Now you're pushing me onto dangerous territory. So first, I think that you want to be very careful in interpreting anything Warren Buffett says, because
Agreed.
Warren is smarter than you.
And more conniving.
And like, I mean, I have literally I'd followed him into trades. I've seen what he's done, and almost inevitably where someone's like, oh, Buffett made a mistake. It's like, man, no, you missed an option that he bought. And people will highlight the dynamic of him selling 15-year puts on the Nikkei, the S&P. There's my dog in the background. Selling puts on the S&P, Nikkei, FTSE, and Euro stocks, in 2007 are like, oh, how could you be so dumb and not realize that it was actually the terms of that trade construction that allowed him to take 10% of Goldman Sachs for a song, right? Brilliant trade construction. And so I would be very careful in terms of interpreting that. I think Warren knows quite well that you can't actually use zero interest rates to discount equities, for the very simple reason that the payoff functions, going back to option theory, of equities are radically different than a zero coupon bond. And I do think that this is actually going to play into the dynamics of what we see going forward, right? So in really simple terms, if you think about the outcomes from an equity, it looks, like an upward sloping cone where the, upward sloping in terms of its mean, but the outcomes are zero and let's just call it infinity to make life simple, right? And so at the terminal point is where you have maximum uncertainty. If I think about a riskless bond, a risk-free bond, a sovereign bond, it's actually the exact opposite. It looks like a football, right? I have maximum certainty at the end point. So to relate those two instruments, you actually have to use options, right? And this goes back to put-call parity, which is that the value of a stock is actually the value of a call minus a put plus the present value of the dividends plus the present value of the forward strike price, right? Now, if I do that, all of a sudden I realize I have a totally indeterminate equation, because what I do know is that the forward strike, right, that is sensitive to interest rates, right? So higher interest rates means that's going to fall in value. Lower interest rates means that's going to rise in value. The dividend is uncertain because the dividend has a nominal and a real component to it, as well as a share of the economy component to it, right? So do corporate profits rise or fall based on the underlying phenomenon? Is the interest rate a real phenomenon, or is it an inflation phenomenon? If it's an inflation phenomenon, then you would expect your dividends to rise, right? And it's unclear what the discount factor would do to that PV component. On the call minus put component, you know explicitly that it works in the opposite direction of interest rates, because calls rise in value as interest rates rise because they're effectively a loan, right? And puts fall in value as interest rates rise, right? So that call minus put component of the value goes up. Like, there is no way to use interest rates to figure out what the value of equities are,
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good point. And you only have to look to other markets like Japan or Europe or whatever, where you've got lower
Right.
interest rates than what we observe in the US.
Exactly. And so this is
Negative rates, and
yeah,
you have
exactly. And
valuation
this is the
multiples.
silliness, right? I mean, no one is doing the work. Nobody's stopping to say, hey, wait a second, theoretically, there is no link between these two, right? It just creates a really nice narrative that allows people to say, hey, equities are going up, and it's all because of the
Well,
Fed.
Asness discredited the Fed model in like a early 1990s paper, and many have discredited it since. I think we've got a paper in the actuarial journal that discredits it as well. I mean, there's just no theoretical or empirical basis for the Fed model. But the reality is stocks go up, and people need justification to buy, and this enters the lexicon without having any sort of empirical merit, and that's just the way.
So
it goes.
this is
I
great.
would just highlight that the Fed model actually came from Ed Yardeni, who also was the guy who said, hey, guess what? The world's going to fall apart on Y2K, right? So I had a theological debate with somebody on Twitter earlier today where I pointed out that, zero doesn't always mean the absence of something, right? It can be positive something and negative something, right? That's like, there's just no evidence. There's no theoretical link. There's actually increasingly negative empirical evidence, right? Where we actually see interest rates rise alongside equities typically, right?
Correct.
The correlation
Richard
is
Werner's
positive.
done some work on that too.